Okay, I believe we can start. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Peer Review and How It Works. I'm Melissa, Marketing Executive at F1000, and I'll be here to provide any technical support in today's session. So before we start, I will cover some webinar housekeeping. First of all participants will be muted throughout the webinar, but please do write your questions in the questions box, which can be found on your GoToWebinar control panel, which looks like the image on this slide. Our presenters will be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. However, if your question isn't answered today, we'll be in touch with you shortly after. Also, if you need to drop off the webinar for any reason, the session is being recorded and will be sent to you one day after the webinar. I will now pass over to Diana Marshall, Head of Reviewer Programs at Taylor & Francis, and Louise Wheeler, Senior Editorial Assistant at F1000. They will be walking you through the different types of peer review and their benefits.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melissa, and welcome everybody again to our webinar today. As Melissa said, we're going to be talking today about peer review, understanding what happens during peer review, and particularly focusing on some of the different types of peer review that you might encounter, both as an author and potentially as a peer reviewer as well. But to just get us started, let's first look at what peer review is and just get a quick overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about peer review. So here is a summary in this diagram here of the main steps and elements of the assessment of an article at a journal. Different journals will have slightly different approaches, but in most the key aspects will be quite similar. There's usually a stage where the author will submit their article into a journal and might have to fill out particular questions or forms as part of that process. And then there might well be some initial checks at the journal where the journal makes sure that the article fulfills the basic requirements. So checking that all of the right files are present and that kind of thing. If those checks are okay, then often an editor will make an initial assessment of an article as well to see whether it fits the journal and whether it's suitable for peer review. If the editor has any concerns or feels that an article isn't suitable for the journal, then they might reject at that point before it's gone to external reviewers, or they might decide that it's time to send it to peer review. And those peer reviewers are usually at least two people who are independent experts, so other scholars in the field who can provide an assessment on whether the article is valid, what the significance of the work is, and ultimately whether or not it is suitable for publication. And once those reports have been received, then the editor will make their decision, looking at those reports and thinking about their own perspective on the article as well. And that step of sending the article to the peer reviewers and what happens and what we mean by different types of peer review is what we're going to be looking at today. And in some ways, this step will be really similar across different journals. As a reviewer, you would get access to the article that you are being asked to review, maybe some instructions on anything particular that the journal wants you to think about. And you'll probably have some kind of form to fill out in an online submission system. And in that form, you may have to answer some specific questions in addition to filling out a free text box with comments for the authors. And there might also be opportunities to give confidential comments to the editors as part of that process. From an author perspective, rather than a reviewer perspective, you would probably receive those comments from the reviewers at the point where the editor has given their final decision on the article. And these comments, this commenting process from peer reviewers is a really essential step in making sure that research has been thoroughly assessed so that those reading it know that they can build further work on it. And the idea of those comments is to be constructive, to say what's good about the article as well as what could be improved or built upon, and giving the information that can help the authors improve their work, but also help the editor to make that decision on whether the article should be accepted for publication or not. And as I said, many of those steps are the same, but there's a few different variations in what we might talk about when we're talking about types of peer review. And that's going to be a really big focus for us today, because as an author or as a peer reviewer, it's really important for you to know what type of peer review is happening at the journal that you are submitting to or reviewing for, so that you know that you're happy with that process and you know what to expect. But before we get into that detail of the different types of peer review, I just want to say another comment about why it's so important. Because that detailed assessment of articles is essential to ensure that what is published is of sufficient quality and can be trusted. And although it can feel sometimes really challenging from the perspective of being an author, at its best, that process is more like a conversation between the editor, the reviewers, and the authors, where the research can be discussed, improved upon, and effectively communicated to the wider research community. And as has come out through surveys, such as a recent survey from Sense About Science, generally researchers do agree that the process of going through peer review as an author does improve their work. So getting that feedback is really helpful. So I've mentioned there the different sort of a process of peer review, the broad overview of what you might expect to happen through the steps of assessment at the journal, and something about the importance of peer review. What I mostly want to talk about today is the different types of peer review that you might encounter, both as an author and as a reviewer, what to expect and how to kind of break down a little bit the positives and negatives of the different approaches so that you can decide which one feels right for you, really. And there's a few different factors here that you could think about when you're thinking about what type of peer review you are encountering at a journal. The first of these factors, and probably one of the really key ones, most important one in many ways, is who knows who in the process. So one way of defining different types of peer review is whether the author is known to the reviewers. So does the reviewer know who the author is of the article that they're assessing? And does the author know who the reviewers are? Or do they just receive the comments without any names? So who knows who in the process is a key factor that differentiates different types of peer review. Another key factor that differentiates different types of peer review is whether or not the reviewer reports are published alongside the article, if the article is published, and whether or not they include the name of the reviewer. So again, you can see there's a stage here where review reports might not be published, they might be published without a name, or they might be published with a reviewer name. And that's another variation in peer review that you might encounter. And a final variation is when does peer review take place? So the structure that I outlined at the beginning is very much based on what might be termed a traditional model, where peer review takes place at the journal before the article is published. But that's not the only model that's happening at the moment. So there's a bit more to cover there in terms of when peer review takes place. And as you can see, understanding what different factors are involved in the type of peer review at a particular journal can be really important, because as a reviewer, you may be very keen to, you'll want to know if the author is going to know who you are or not, and if your report is going to be published at the end of the process. And there's some really great things around that transparency, and there's some things that you might want to think about and that might challenge you about that. So it's important to know in advance what type of peer review you are going to be encountering. So how do these fit together into different types of peer review? Well, I'm going to look at the identities piece first, because it's one of the key ways that you would hear people defining different types of peer review in terms of anonymity. And one of the most common peer review approaches that you may well come across at different journals is single anonymous peer review. In this model, the reviewers know the identity of the authors, so when they receive the article for peer review, it will say who has written it and their institution and other details about the authors. But the authors don't know who the reviewers are, so that when the reports come back, they will receive the comments, but they won't have any information about who the reviewer is who has made those comments. And this is a really common model of peer review, and in some ways, the benefit of this model is just the familiarity. Actually, people know what to expect in a single anonymous peer review model frequently. But where the criticism comes from for this model is whether or not the identity of the author could generate some unconscious bias in reviewers. Whether it's about who the authors are, what their background is, the institution. We all know that we have unconscious biases, and the concern can be that some of that could come into this process and into the reviewer's assessment if they know the identity of the author. So some of the other models around identities in peer review are actually focused on addressing that concern about bias. I'm just going to quickly note that there's one question that's come in that I want to clarify really quickly here. There's been a question saying, aren't authors themselves reviewers and vice versa? Yes, that is absolutely true, but not on the same article, obviously, because it would be a different researcher who would be interacting as the reviewer if somebody on an article where somebody is an author. So there would be different researchers involved. Here, everybody involved in this process is a researcher in some way. I'm distinguishing here between authors and reviewers on the basis of the different role that a researcher might be taking on an article. So I just wanted to clarify that quite quickly. Oh, I've clicked on 2 slides and I can't see how to go back. Previous, there we go. Great. So as I said, in terms of the different types of peer review, now a lot of this is focused on the identities and trying to address that concern of bias. And one of the really common ways of trying to reduce bias in peer review is what's called double anonymous review. So in this case, authors don't know the identity of the reviewers in the same way as single anonymous review, but the double anonymity here comes in that reviewers do not know the identity of the authors. So when the reviewer receives the article for peer review, it will be anonymized, so the author's institution and details are removed from the article. So the idea here is that the reviewer will judge the article purely on the merits of the research in front of them, rather than any unconscious bias about the identity of the author coming into play. This is a very popular approach. Many researchers do really appreciate this as an approach to peer review. But there have been some studies which do indicate that trying to anonymise a paper, an article for review, is a bit harder than might be assumed. This study by O'Connor et al. In 2017 identified that a double anonymous review could fail to conceal author identity in a good number of cases. Now, again, this isn't somebody revealing an identity unnecessarily or anything like that. It's just that factor that if you're within a research field, you know who's publishing what, you know who's working in different areas, and you might also, as a researcher within that field, be aware of different writing styles, for example. So this is what can break that anonymity. If you're particularly in a niche field where there's only a few groups working on particular projects, then it might be obvious who's written the article, even with that anonymisation. So double anonymous review is an option for trying to address this concern around bias. It's a good one. It might not always be perfect. So that's just something to consider when you're submitting to different journals and thinking about what type of peer review you prefer. A different approach to address bias within peer review is to open up the process, sort of that reverse of the double anonymity. Here, everybody knows who everybody is. So the reviewers know the identity of the authors and the authors also know the identity of the reviewers. So this usually happens at the end of the process, at the point where the author would receive the reports. Rather than receiving just the comments, they would receive the name of the reviewer at the same time. It's important to note here that open peer review in terms of the authors knowing the identity of the reviewers once that process is complete doesn't necessarily say anything about whether those reviewer identities are made public. That's kind of a separate step. Some open peer review journals do that openness, so it's only the authors who find out who the reviewers are. And some open peer review journals, also the reviewer identities are either kind of noted on the article, so it's clear who reviewed it, or if the reports are published, then it might include the reviewer name on that report. So it's important, again, if you're reviewing for an open peer review journal, to know exactly who's going to find out who you are and how that information is going to be shared. Again, it's actually a really good thing. I'm a real fan of open peer review. I think that it helps to increase awareness of who said what in a peer review process. I think it helps to increase a sense of collaboration in peer review. And there is some evidence that open peer review can also help to improve the quality of peer review reports, particularly in that reviewers tend to back up their comments more in open peer review models. So open peer review can be a really good thing. As reviewers and as authors, I would encourage you to think positively about this kind of approach. But at the same time, it's important for you to know what you're going to know about the peer review process, who's going to know it, and at what point within those processes. So it's just good to be aware before you start your review. So that's the pieces around identities. For publishing reports, there is a couple of options here that you might encounter. Relatively few journals do publish peer review reports. Normally these are only available to the editor and to the author. Some journals do publish the reports if the article itself is published. So when the article goes live and says this is approved for peer review, there might be some comments provided with that to show who said what about that article. If the reports are published without reviewer names, so you know what was said but not who said it, then that's sometimes called transparent peer review. You might have come across that term. And if those reports are published with reviewer names, then that's normally referred to as a form of open peer review, because again, it's about the identity, but more people know who that reviewer is, as well as what was said. So here's an example of what publishing reports might look like on one particular journal. Often journals that publish the review reports will also provide the author comments so that you can not only see what the reviewer said, but what the authors said in response to that. And on this particular journal, here's the example of when you click on the review report link, what it looks like. So as you can see, in this case, you're not seeing the name of the reviewer, but you're seeing all of the comments that they made. And then that final piece of variation is around when peer review happens. So the most common approach is that peer review happens at the journal before the article is available for others to read, and that it's a confidential process. So only the editor, the authors, and the reviewers actually know what's going on within that step. And that's a very common approach, which is employed by most journals, and that's why I kind of outlined that at the beginning. But there is another approach, which you're going to hear a bit more about from Lewis shortly, because this is the approach taken by F1000, where the article is available before peer review. As you can see here in this screenshot, this article is awaiting peer review, and there's a status update that peer reviewers have been invited. And then peer review happens and is live as a process once the article is live. And that's sometimes called post-publication peer review. So if it's happening before anybody else can read the article, then it's sort of pre-publication peer review. If it's happening after the article is available, then it's post-publication peer review. It's important to note that in many cases now, you might see articles which are live on preprint servers. That's a very different thing. Most preprint servers don't actively engage in peer review, and articles may be put on a preprint server before they're ready, before they go to a journal for peer review, and then still go through that publication peer review process within a journal, with the editors and the authors and the reviewers doing that as a confidential process before it gets published in a journal. So those are the three kind of factors that might come into account when you're thinking about the type of peer review that you might be encountering. Who knows who, when peer review happens, and whether or not the reports are published. And so I've got a couple of quick poll questions for you before we jump into a bit more detail about what F1000 does specifically. And my first question for you is going to be around which of these forms of sharing identities were you most aware of before this webinar? So what I'm going to do in just a moment is I'm going to launch a poll. You'll see these options on your screen, but on a sort of blue background that shows that the poll is live. Please do click one of the options to vote in the poll. Now, I do know that this doesn't always work brilliantly with everybody's web browser, and if you're joining on a mobile device, then it might sometimes be a bit harder. Don't panic if you can't participate in the poll. It is not a problem at all, but it would be great to hear from you. So, which form of sharing identities in peer review were you most familiar with before this webinar happened? And you should be able to see the poll now. And I'm just going to leave it open for a little while to let more people vote. Just going to leave it open for a few more seconds. So still I can see people must be clicking to vote still. As I say, don't panic if you can't, if your web interface is not allowing you to vote in this poll. It's just really interesting to see what people are most familiar with. Okay, I'm just going to leave it open 5 more seconds and then it's going to close. Okay, so just to show you what you all said, interestingly, me having said single anonymous may well be the most common version of peer review that you come across, double anonymous was actually better known to you before we started. So that's really interesting for me to see. I hope that the information about open has been useful for as many people didn't pick that as the one that was most familiar to them before the start of this webinar. Fantastic. So that was one of my 2 questions for you today. I'm just trying not to click on too many slides. Here we go. So also, having heard what you've heard so far in the webinar today, my next question is, do you think it's a good idea for reviewers' names and reports to be visible to readers? A few different options here to pick from. Yes, it increases transparency in research assessment and discussion. Or yes, it enables researchers to get acknowledgement for their contributions for peer review. That's actually a benefit that I didn't really bring out in my initial discussion, but it's absolutely there. If somebody can see that you reviewed an article, it's really easy to say, yeah, look at this contribution that I'm doing to my research field. Do you think no, it's not a good idea because less experienced researchers may be concerned about making critical comments? That certainly can be a challenge. It can feel quite intimidating to make those comments if you feel like others are going to be able to read them as well. Is that something that you think should be a concern, or should we just give more support to researchers to help them make their comments really great? Or do you think, no, it's not a good idea because authors may be embarrassed about public critique of their work? So Do you think it is a good idea for reviewers' names and reports to be visible to readers? Oh, and I think I might even have an extra option on the actual poll here. So there's an extra option here as, yes, it's a good idea as long as research can access training. So maybe that's an option if you think less experienced researchers may be concerned, but if they can access training, then maybe it's a good idea. So where's your feeling on this about whether it's a good idea for reviewers' names and reports to be visible to readers of an article? Just going to give a few more moments for the Okay, I think most people have voted now, so I'm going to close the poll and share it there. And the majority have said yes, which is probably really good news for my colleague Lewis. Yes, it increases transparency. Yes, it enables researchers to get acknowledgement. And that's probably a fantastic opportunity for us to hand over to Lewis, who is going to be telling you a little bit more about some of these transparent processes at F1000.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, that's great news. I first want to talk a little bit about what F1000 is. F1000 offers publishing solutions to organizations as well as directly to academics through our flagship platform, F1000 Research. F1000 Research was launched in 2013 and has since published over 5,000 articles. In 2020, we joined Taylor & Francis Group. Our platforms operate an author-led post-publication peer review model. Our peer review reports are entirely open. I'll go into exactly what this means in the following slides. Our platforms publish research across a wide variety of subject areas. This includes life sciences, physical sciences, social sciences, medicine, engineering, and humanities. When an article is submitted to one of our platforms, our editorial team carries out a few checks to confirm that our policies and ethical guidelines are met. So this also includes our policies surrounding open data. Once these checks have been completed, our production team ensures the article is typeset and proofed. The article is then published. Once the article is published, reviewers are invited to provide comments by the editorial team on behalf of the authors. When the reviewers have returned their comments, they are published alongside the article with the reviewers' full names and affiliations. Authors are then encouraged to revise the article to address the concerns of the reviewers. The original reviewers are then re-invited to assess the article and see if these changes have been made. Publishing articles prior to peer review allows for important research findings to be accessible to the community quickly. This has been particularly important in time-sensitive areas of research, such as COVID and Ebola. Validations and critiques of research are openly and publicly available. We feel that this transparency promotes a constructive peer review process. In our model, authors are primarily responsible for identifying reviewers. This is just because we feel that authors are best placed to understand the research landscape. They might know sort of research groups that are actively publishing in it and who are experts in their own work. Once you receive a peer review report, we check to ensure they meet our peer review code of conduct and give them a light copy edit just to fix any minor grammatical errors. We aim to publish peer review reports as quickly as possible. So normally we publish peer review reports the same day, but if it's outside of our office hours, such as at the weekend, it'll be the next working day. Once the peer review report has been published, we're attached to the article permanently and can't be taken down, apart from really exceptional circumstances. As we have no academic editors who make decisions whether or not to publish a paper, it's really important that we have clearly defined objective reviewer criteria. Our criteria are designed in a way that enables our readers to quickly and confidently check to ensure that reviewers have the right expertise to assess a manuscript. As we operate an author-led model, it's really important that our in-house editorial team check to make sure that our reviewers meet our criteria and verify their email addresses. The first thing we check is to ensure that the reviewer is qualified. So normally this means holding a doctorate, but in fields such as library sciences, where it's quite uncommon for researchers to hold a doctorate, we also check to make sure we have a public record of demonstrable expertise. The second thing we check is to ensure that the reviewer is an expert in the subject area. We consider this to mean that they have published three articles as the lead author in the topic, with one of these articles having been published in the last 5 years. This has the added benefit of ensuring the reviewer has experience with the publication and peer review process. Another thing we check for is to make sure that a reviewer has no conflicts of interest. An example of a disqualifying conflict of interest would be recent collaboration with the author of the paper, working at the same institution, or a financial competing interest, such as like we wouldn't invite a tobacco-funded researcher to peer review an article which is also funded by the tobacco industry. We strongly encourage a global spread of reviewers. This is the peer review box that can be found on the right-hand side of all articles we publish. At the top, you can see the current review status. There are 3 approval statuses a reviewer can choose. Approved means that only very minor revisions are needed overall, and the article is pretty much valid. And approved reservations is chosen when the article requires a few small changes and occasionally a more significant revision before the article can be considered valid. And finally, a not approved, which means the article is not valid and requires substantial revisions to be made. To pass peer review, each article requires either 2 approved reports or 1 approved and 2 approved reservations. We always encourage authors to revise the article to address reviewer comments. In this example, the article received 2 approved reports now and can be considered to have passed peer review. It's only when an article was passed peer review that they were indexed in bibliographic databases such as PubMed. You can also see that the first reviewer has submitted an updated peer review report for the latest version. We call these re-reviews. You're able to click read underneath the approval status to see the full report. And at the bottom, you can clearly see the full names and affiliations of each reviewer. Peer reviewers at F1000 must follow our code of conduct. The first thing we ask for is that our reviewers read the text in full, and this includes any figures, tables, and all the data. We also ask that the peer reviewers discuss the article in full and demonstrate an understanding of the article. We ask that reviewers contain as much detail as possible, and just to help our authors sort of action the changes reviewers have suggested. We strongly encourage criticism in our peer review reports, but this has to be constructive. We think that criticism is a vital part of the process, but if it isn't helpful, there's not much point to it. It can be quite disparaging. We also ask that reviewers should only criticize the contents of the article and not the authors themselves. Seems obvious, but this is an example of a peer review report we published in February this year. At the top, you can see a citation of this peer review report, including a DOI. This is a very high quality report. This report includes a short summary of the article and provides additional context in which the article was written. It avoids unqualified statements such as the methods are inadequate. Unqualified statements are often unhelpful, and as they do not include suggestions of how the article could be improved. This report is very specific in what the reviewer feels and improve the validity of the article. This report is also very well structured and easy to follow. It addresses each section of the article in order: introduction, methods, results, discussion. Another good way to structure a report would be splitting out into major comments and minor comments. Another thing we like about this review is that it doesn't shy away from saying what is good in the article. This validates the author, as well as having the added benefit of highlighting to our readers points which may be of particular interest. The example on the previous slide was a review of a case study. When reviewing case studies, we ask that reviewers focus on the background of the case's history and whether the case is presented with enough detail to be useful for teaching. The example on this slide is a report of an opinion article. Different article types, as they have very different aims, have different criteria for review. For opinion articles, we might ask that authors ensure that the opinions are properly discussed in the context of current literature and the arguments are backed up with proper citations. We provide reviewer guidelines for each article type we publish, and these questions just help to focus a review. Thanks to our version system, our articles are living. There's always the opportunity to submit a new version. As the process is open, it is clear what has changed and why. And not approved is not a rejection. We'd never reject an article. We always feel there's room for improvement. A benefit of our version system is it allows for innovative article types, such as the living systematic review in this example. A living systematic review is a systematic review which is continually updated as new evidence becomes available. So in this example, this article is updated quarterly. When this article was first published in September 2020, it included 2,000 projects. But the latest version, which was just last month, it had over 12,000 projects included. We're aware that many of our peer reviewers might be unfamiliar with these article types. So in our invitation emails, we tend to include a short explanation of what they are and what is expected of them. This article helps researchers and funders prioritize resources to reach unmet research needs. As COVID is such a rapidly evolving field, it's important that this knowledge gets out there as quickly as possible. Having one article that is regularly updated rather than a whole new article each time reduces research waste and reviewer fatigue, as we only ask reviewers to assess what has changed in the manuscript between each iteration. This is evident in the change in the length of peer review reports between versions. So as you can see here, the length of the peer review report received for version 1 is a lot longer and took a lot longer to write than in the latest version, in version 5. Along with different article types, different subject areas also have unique criteria. Physical sciences can be quite objective with their reviews. This often leads to quite concise reports with essential actionable comments. Reviews for humanity papers, such as this example, are often more subjective, and it's quite common for reviews with approved statuses to still have minor disagreements with the authors, as was the case with this article. Our platforms also use a comment system to allow for constructive debate on the articles we publish. Our comment system allows for our readers and the research community to discuss an article without being a part of the formal peer review process. Our comment system also allows for cooperation between the author and reviewer. This cooperation takes place openly, instead of through an intermediary such as an editor. This allows for authors to communicate directly with reviewers why they may not feel as viable to action changes suggested by the reviewer, which is the case here. In this example, a reviewer has questioned why an article doesn't contain some data. The authors responded using our comment system to explain why it's not possible to include this data and informed the reviewer that they have included in the revision of in the revised version of the article to make this clearer. We strongly encourage reviewers to write their peer review reports with the help of a co-reviewer. In a more traditional peer review model, writing reviews with co-reviewer typically requires permission of the journal, as this requires sharing an article that is not yet published. As peer review at F1000 takes place after publication, this isn't the case. Writing a report with a co-reviewer allows for reviewers with different expertise to assess different areas of a manuscript. An example where this may be useful is if the paper is heavy in statistics. It might be appropriate to co-review the article with a statistician. Writing a report with a co-reviewer may also allow researchers that do not meet our reviewer criteria to contribute to the formal peer review process. This is particularly helpful for early career researchers. A recent study surveying early career researchers found that over 70% of respondents had ghostwritten a peer review report in which they will not be invited a reviewer, yet almost half the respondents hadn't received any credit for doing so. Open reviewing ensures that our reviewers get the credit they deserve for their work. Reviewers can see how many people have read their report, they're able to add their peer review report to author ID, and their full names and affiliations are published alongside the article. Finally, our model is used on all of our gateways on F1000 Research, including the AXA Research Fund and Manipal Academy of Higher Education gateways. It is also used on all of our platforms, including Open Research Europe and Welcome Open Research. Thank you for your time, and does anybody have any questions?